Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar from Homewood Health, and thank you for making some time this evening to join us. So my name is Emma Rickard. I have a background in social work and I've worked in Canada in the employee and assistance programming field for just over 15 years now. Initially I worked as a counsellor working directly with clients, as well as in program development. I joined Homewood Health in 2014, initially as a regional clinical manager in Alberta and then in British Columbia. And my current role is as the regional director for Western Canada for Homewood's EAP program. So I'm delighted that you've been able to join us this evening. And I'd like to introduce Homewood as well for those of you who are maybe not familiar with our organisation. Homewood Health is Canada's leader in mental health and addiction services. We provide a continuum of stay at work, return to work and treatment services through our team of over 4,500 staff and clinical professionals. Our complete suite of services includes organisational wellness, employee and family assistance programs, assessments, outpatient and inpatient treatment, recovery management, return to work and family services. All that can be customised to meet the needs of individuals and organisations. So this evening, the session that you've joined is going to focus in on discussing the psychological impacts of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic on our children, while highlighting factors that can promote and preserve their mental health and well-being and resiliency during and beyond the pandemic. So I'd like to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, including the audio. So you're welcome to take notes if you would like, but it's an opportunity to put down your pen and relax a little in your chair after what I'm sure has been a very busy day, to just listen and engage in the material that I hope is interesting and useful for you. There is a Q&A function, and you are welcome to ask questions there throughout the presentation today, and I'll do my very best to leave a little time at the end to have a look at those and answer the questions that I'm able to. All right, so let's get going. So how are our children? This ongoing pandemic is certainly taking a toll on children's mental health. Kids are suffering from anxiety and fear about the virus, and long-term social isolation and the increased dependency on technology are other impacts, and there are many more. So in light of that, the objective of tonight's webinar is, as the coronavirus crisis continues, acknowledging that parents everywhere are struggling to keep children healthy and occupied. And if you're feeling anxious about how to protect and nurture your own children through this, often simultaneously juggling work obligations, then you're in good virtual company. So tonight we will review the psychological impacts of the pandemic on our children. We're going to look at some age-appropriate strategies for supporting children's mental health, look at indicators or signs that your child may be struggling, as well as focusing on the all-important arena of parent and caregiver support. And then towards the end, we'll be looking at identifying resources and support that you can tap into as needed. So why is this pandemic so stressful? This pandemic affects us on every level: psychological, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual. There's not an area of life that's not been impacted. During the initial threat of COVID, our bodies were engaged in a stress response. And when someone confronts an oncoming car or another danger, then the eyes or the ears, or sometimes both, send information to the amygdala in our brain. This is an area of our brain that contributes to emotional processing. And the amygdala interprets the images and sounds it receives, and when it perceives them as being a danger signal, it instantly sends a distress signal to another area of the brain called the hypothalamus. All of these changes happen so very quickly that we aren't generally even aware that they're occurring. In fact, this wiring is so efficient that the amygdala and the hypothalamus start this cascade even before the brain's visual centers have really had a chance to fully process what's happening. And that's why we hear stories of people doing seemingly miraculous things like jumping out of the path of an oncoming car before they've even had a chance to think about what they're doing. So if that's what happens during a stress response, when our brain comes back online after a life-threatening event, it's only then that we can really begin to process the emotions. But the challenge with COVID is, when is the after? You know, it's been a year and nearly a half. So some people are still describing the feeling of white knuckling it through every day. And it's important to keep this in mind as I move on to talking a little bit more about understanding children's mental health and supporting parents. Because a huge part, a proportion of supporting mental health and well-being during a time of COVID is about creating a calm body that can process emotions. So from moving from that tense alert state into a relaxed one, because only then can our unconscious emotions begin to come to the surface, to our awareness, so we can make sense of them and move on. Having so many areas of our life affected at the same time by a sudden and unexpected change is truly extraordinary. And the slide just highlights some of them. You know, our relationships with others, our home life, work, recreational environments, sometimes our financial resources being impacted can all bring about a great deal of uncertainty, confusion, worry, and stress. You may have heard of Dr. Gordon Neufeld. He's a now retired Canadian clinical psychologist who did a lifetime's work with children, youth, and their caregivers. Famously, perhaps, the author of the bestseller, Hold On to Your Kids, a fabulous book talking about children's relationships with their parents. So this quote really highlights that one of the extraordinary challenges of this time is that often connection and relationship are presented as the cure or a protective factor, as a counter to feelings of stress, depression, and anxiety. But a unique factor of this pandemic is it's that very togetherness that we're asked to withhold. A research team did a very interesting study looking at more than 1,000 parents of children and youth aged 2 to 18 years old, and nearly 350 youth between the age of 10 and 18. This study took place last year between April and June, and they looked at 6 different domains of mental health, and they included depression, anxiety, irritability, attention span, hyperactivity, and obsessions and compulsions. And what they found was that just over 70% of school-age children, so the 6 to 18-year-olds, and 61% of preschool-age children, so the 2 to 5-year-olds, reported a deterioration in at least one of those 6 domains. Interestingly, they found that a smaller proportion, so just over 19% of the school-age children and 31% of the preschool-age children reported improvement in at least one of those 6 domains. So to quote, we found that overall children were faring mostly worse and occasionally better compared to their pre-pandemic self. So this is from Dr. Daphne Korzak, a child and adolescent psychiatrist at Sick Kids Hospital, who was the principal investigator of the study. And she went on to say, we also found that the mental health impacts of the pandemic were greater for school-age children during the first lockdown, underscoring the importance of in-class learning and extracurricular activities for children. Having a pre-existing psychiatric or neurodevelopmental diagnosis was associated with both improvements and deterioration in mental health. So the researchers note that for some children with pre-existing conditions, stay-at-home directives actually might have provided some relief from some of the sources of stress in their life. So therefore improving symptoms of anxiety or irritability. However, for some other children with diagnoses such as autism spectrum disorder or ADHD, the loss of that structure, routine, consistency, and familiar social interactions may actually have had significant negative impacts on their mental health and well-being. So not everyone is impacted the same way, but interestingly, this research at least indicates that the impact for children, the impact is mostly worse, but occasionally better. Each of these determinants on these slides, considered social determinants of health, will have a role and an impact when it comes to the health of an individual. The way that these determinants intersect, so overlap or interact with each other, must be considered because they add to different levels and nuances when it comes to health considerations for any one individual. In the context of this presentation this evening, what's really key to understand is that the quality of these social determinants of health that a child experiences really helps us in explaining the health inequalities or inequities that may exist between different children or between different groups of children. So like many things, mental health is multi-causal, multifactorial. There are many different factors interplaying to determine any individual's mental health. Public health emergencies like pandemics certainly take a toll on the physical as well as the mental health of people. And children are particularly vulnerable because of their limited understanding of an event. They're unable to escape the harms of the situation physically and mentally because they just haven't developed a full range of coping strategies yet. And depending on their age, they may not be able to communicate their feelings in the same way that adults do, which is often verbally. The closure of schools and the separation from friends can cause stress and anxiety in children. Exposure to mass media coverage of crisis events and unverified information circulating on social media may aggravate their mental distress. Different studies have shown that crisis events negatively impact the psychological well-being of children. Some of the most common ways that presents are through increased anxiety, depression, sleep disturbances and appetite disturbances, so changes in patterns seen previously, as well as through an impairment in social interactions. There was actually a recent study conducted in China that screened both children and adolescents for behavioural and emotional distress that was due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the most common behavioural problems they identified across that full range of ages was clinginess, distraction, irritability, and fear that family members may contract the deadly disease. So some really interesting studies giving us more information about the impact and the way that it's showing up in children. Mental health issues can affect youth at any age, but certain situations and the quality or circumstances of their social determinants of health that are at play can place some young people at a higher risk. So key social determinants that could place young people at higher risk would include a family history of mental illness, potentially new immigrants or refugees who are experiencing difficult economic situations, Indigenous children and youth who have suffered from intergenerational trauma, racism and social inequalities that likely have impacted access to education and work opportunities, as well as key health issues such as access to clean water and proper health care. Also LGBTQ children and youth who have experienced bullying and or rejection from their families. It's a key social determinant, alongside big life changes. So examples might be moving to a new city, moving to a new school, changing schools, separation or divorce of their caregivers, serious illness or death of a relative or a friend, another social determinant, facing or witnessing trauma, including abuse, and finally substance use. It certainly doesn't mean that any of these things happening is going to cause a child to have a mental health crisis, but it is a factor to consider when understanding the impact on any individual child. So that was all a bit heavy. So let's move on then to some good news. Actually, there are some proven mental health benefits of COVID-19. So when we dig into that a little bit further, what we're learning is disease containment measures like social isolation and bubbles with your own family have actually enabled families to spend more quality time together. Many parents have reported an increased sense of closeness and intimacy with their children, away from the busy demands of scheduling and competing demands of other people and all those demands on our time. And they've found that they're able to make use of this quality time by reading a book, making drawings with kids, engaging them in household chores or teaching skills, like cleaning or cooking or home maintenance, occupying kids with fun activities and play like indoor scavenger hunts, board games, card games. The list is endless of what people are rediscovering. And the impact of all of these things has been to reduce the stress and boredom due to home confinement, not just for the kids, but also for the parents. And interestingly, moreover, adolescents who have adopted a new hobby while in confinement have been shown to experience even fewer somatic depressive symptoms, so things like change of appetite, liveliness, difficulty sleeping or difficulty concentrating. So this result is congruent with conclusions of the review of a number of different studies, really demonstrating that children and adolescents who take up creative activities do better at managing their mental health. So there's a vote for creative play, the arts and fun activities as actually being a way to support our mental health. So permission to play. So we're now going to move on, having looked at why the pandemic is impacting us and how it's impacting children, to really considering a bit more, what can we do? What can you and I do? So how each family stay connected, shares feelings and emotions, and finds ways to play together and apart are going to impact how likely any given child will be to bounce back or to find ways to thrive and not just survive, both during the challenges of this pandemic, but also following. So a key factor is being able to recognise our children's feelings and help them do the same. An example might be calmly saying to a child, I can see that you're upset that you can't have that sleepover with your friends right now. So acknowledging and accepting and helping the child name the emotion that they're feeling. Guiding questions can also be very helpful for older children and teens to begin to prompt them to work through issues. So an example of a guided question: I know it's disappointing that you're not able to do some of the things that you did before the pandemic. What are some of the ways that you can still have fun with your friends? So really, again, that empathizing, naming and acknowledging the feeling while collaborating with the teen or the older child to begin to find some solutions or focus on what is possible. We also need to remember that everyone focuses on grief and loss in unique ways, and children are often considered the forgotten mourners. Sometimes they're overlooked in the grieving process because they seem to bounce back or quickly resume their lives and routines with no qualms. However, children need to grieve for losses too, and in ways that are age appropriate and may not be verbal. We need to remember that their ability to do that is impacted by their level of cognitive development. So children do grieve differently than adults, and in a large part that's because of the developmental stage that they're in and how that impacts their ability to understand and conceptualize loss and grief. So for example, when it comes to death, very young children under the age of around 2 often won't have an understanding of it. But moving into preschool age, so sort of 2 to 6 years old, children will have an understanding of death, but will often see it as impermanent. So they'll believe that pet goldfish is going to come back, or that someone who's died is going to return or reappear. So there are different challenges at different ages, and kids are undoubtedly impacted by the adults around them and how we as adults allow or avoid these difficult emotions. Children learn from us, and the same happens when it comes to the grieving process. If an adult is suppressing or numbing or avoiding, denying the emotions related to their grief or the grief process, children will follow suit. For those reasons, open communication between adults is key to helping the adults and the children process and move through their grief. And don't forget the use of play to help children cope, with its focus on actions rather than words, much more the world of a child. And through their actions, we and children can begin to sort of decode their behaviour. So for young children, play might be the only way available for them to work through all those feelings and emotions, be they anxiety, fear about loss or death. So as far as we can, it's important to allow our children to play without judgment, deterrent, or interference, but really to leave room for exploration and discovery. Playing as children's work, it's the way they work things out in a way that reduces the scariness and promotes understanding. And sometimes they may play the same theme over and over again, you might notice, as they process and work through these feelings. You know, an example might be a young child who's playing with a doll and pretending the doll is hurt, and maybe allowing that doll to cry for a little while. But also we can invite the child, if they'd like, to comfort the doll and perhaps fix up that doll's boo-boos and maybe care for the doll in nursing it back to good health. Another factor to consider are children's feelings around peer relationships and social status changes at different ages through their lifespan. Many children, I think particularly older ones, really do not want unwanted attention or to be singled out in any way. And so that might cause them to really try and avoid the feelings of grief and sadness for fear that these difficult feelings will lead to displaying emotions, tearfulness or upset, having to discuss emotions, and so may lead them to withdraw and really avoid some situations and a discussion just out of this self-consciousness. So that sadness is still there, and what can happen is it might manifest itself in a way that we don't typically associate with sadness. So a child struggling to process the sadness of a loss might actually behave in ways that seem like they're frustrated or angry, or they're acting out. And that really might just be a distraction from the true emotion of sadness that's at play. So sometimes we need to look a little beneath the surface and help our children to do the same thing. So we're now going to begin to look at some strategies for supporting children during COVID-19. So I'm going to walk us through the 4 here on the screen. So this top one, again, really important to be honest and authentic. Kids are pretty good detectors of when we're faking it, and they'll call us out when we're inconsistent. So it's important to give age-appropriate, honest, factual information. It's helpful if we can at times be open about our own emotions, what we're feeling, what our experience or reaction to something is. This can really help children around us see that it's okay to have feelings, that everybody does, but also show them that they can develop skills to manage those emotions, that they don't have to be overwhelming or feel out of control. Another factor for supporting children is supporting them to manage the news intake that they're exposed to. So again, children look to adults around them to learn how frightened they should be, what's important, what they should pay attention to. So it's really helpful if adults can take on the responsibility or the job of taking in the news and then conveying it to children, particularly for younger children, rather than leaving young children to view news on their own without that guidance or support to interpret it, process it, and explore how it's making them feel and deal with those feelings. Discussing news is in the context of supportant relationships is really important, is really helpful, and it breaks it down into manageable bits. It's also helpful to help children, particularly as they get older, learn about credible news sources, the pros and cons of different social media sites, and to be curious and explore with them where they're exposed to news and how they process that, and perhaps volunteering to sit with them and explore or experience some of that news together, so you can process it and explore it and support them to understand it through your lens. So curiosity with children is so important. Asking them about what they're hearing and what they're thinking, responding to any of their questions with facts where you have them, and honesty that you don't know when you don't know. It's important to allow children to lead those conversations and you follow. Their questions and statements will guide you in their readiness to learn a little bit more information. And it's also important to help them limit what they're exposed to and put boundaries around what they are concerned about or how much time they're spending thinking and worrying about the pandemic. So by spending time with them, we can guide them around all of these important factors. And so your presence, therefore, and your attention are key. Being available for questions or expressions of emotions. Obviously, we can't be available 24/7. Letting them know when you will be available helps them manage those expectations and uncertainty. Again, you don't have to have all the answers. Kids are okay with that, again, that honest answer, but don't underestimate the value and comfort of your presence as they come to terms with not knowing. Also, one of the things that you can do is help children find simple activities that they can keep busy with that's going to shift their attention when they're ready away from topics that might be overwhelming, distressing, or upsetting. So who can believe it? One and a third years in. What needs to change about how we talk to our children? So as we pass now the 1-year mark of this pandemic, many children are reporting that their kids, particularly tweens and teens, are still feeling plenty of despair, but are becoming less likely to want to talk about it with them and less likely to want to talk about what's going on. Whereas at the beginning of the pandemic, kids seem to be much more vocal and outwardly upset, they're expressive about all of these sudden changes. And now the feedback is that kids, and you know what, many adults too, are actually just shutting down a bit, seeming a lot more withdrawn and seeming to just get through the day on autopilot. So what worked to connect with your kid or child a year ago, to cheer them up or connect with them, may not be working anymore. And it might be that the times have changed. It might be that they've changed. You know, they've moved on into a new developmental stage. But as a consequence, we need to change too. So we need to explore thinking about new ideas for changing our approach and finding new ways to support children, and importantly, getting them to express their emotions and their needs. So remembering kids need to be in that sort of calm body state before they can process and express their emotions. So some of the tips that others have tried with success are avoiding being overly positive. Kids can cope with some truth and some realism, and it can be more empathetic to actually acknowledge this is really hard and this has been going on for a long time. Also finding creative ways to express difficult emotions. If talking used to work and it doesn't now, how about journaling, co-writing a story together, putting together a silly poem, drawing pictures of how it feels inside for them right now. It's important that we can acknowledge for kids that it's especially hard for them, that they are being impacted in a unique way, and that display of empathy can be a new strategy or trying a strategy in a different way that might support them. Try and avoid lessons and lectures, the feedback from the kids, and instead try and walk beside them with curiosity, inviting them to share what it's like in their shoes. And part of that is asking kids how they feel and really listening. So really trying hard to ask open-ended questions that can't be asked with just a yeah or no. Can you tell me more about that? Can you help me understand? How was that for you? We also need to look for ways to lighten the mood using humour and silliness and play. It's a good thing to challenge our kids to voice an opinion. Ask them what they think about something, what their opinion is, how they'd solve that problem. And the last tip I have for you is to consider changing the scenery. And if it's possible to get out of the house and go to a new spot, certainly now that the weather is a little bit better, but even changing it up in the house. If they've been doing their schoolwork in the same corner of their bedroom over the last year, can you rearrange the room? Can you put the computer in a different space? Can we change up how we're doing things in the home, just to create some sense of breaking out of that same old Groundhog Day. Staying connected, a tried and true and incredibly important aspect of mental health. So finding ways to keep in touch with loved ones. Children worry. They worry about a grandparent who's living alone. They worry about a relative or a friend. They overhear us worrying, and that makes them worry. So when safe and physically distanced visits aren't possible, we really need to think of creative ways to still connect. Many people have been playing around with video chats, and that can be a great way to ease young children's anxiety because of that visual connection where they can see a face, make a silly face, wave, show a picture, share a new book, and not have to rely on trying to have a conversation. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. Whether it's a grandparent, your BFF, teacher, or a mental health worker, we need to also get creative about staying in touch with a broad base of supports. Maybe this is time to start a pen pal game, record a video message, draw a picture for a loved one and put it in the mail, get on TikTok and make a dance with your kids. It might also mean that it's time to consider meeting or reaching out to your family doctor, a pediatrician, occupational therapist, or mental health counsellor if you're concerned about changes that you're seeing in your child. And don't forget the benefits of connecting with other parents. They can be an incredible support, sharing stories and helping to normalise the reality, the raw reality of what it is to parent through this pandemic. Routine. So we hear this again and again, and it's still true. It's really important to participate, us and our children, in regular, predictable activities as much as is possible. To eat, sleep, bathe, and play at regular times that children are used to, and to help children know what to expect, how the day is going to play out, what they can do, and what choices they do have. This helps build self-efficacy in children, which can come from many things. It could be chores around the house, having responsibilities, creating new things through play. But that sense of self-efficacy is so important for children, and it's built in this way. So during the pandemic, it is more important than ever to maintain bedtime and other routines. So although our instinct might be to throw that stuff out the window, what does it matter? In fact, the evidence is we need to double down on those things because they create a sense of order to the day that offers reassurance to children and certainty in an otherwise very uncertain time. And all children, including teenagers, benefit from routines that are predictable yet flexible enough to meet their individual needs. Family time sure is hard enough, even in the best of times, because kids are still learning the basic skills they need to get their needs met. And truth be told, so are parents, as we're living and working on top of each other. We haven't done this before either, and we're learning as we go. So right now, after a year of forced togetherness, it's not surprising that many homes are beginning to feel like a pressure cooker, and children at each other's throats, parents fed up. And it's really important that we can remember that we are certainly not alone in this. It's helpful to try and address the needs and the feelings that are driving the challenging behaviours we're seeing in our kids. Because if we look underneath and see what's at the root of it, we can nip that in the bud. So here on the screen are 5 family habits that you can structure into your life in quarantine to help with managing emotions, meeting needs that aren't met, and thereby healing some of the wounds of healing or avoiding sibling rivalry. So these family habits can really ensure more peace and affection all round, less conflict, regardless of whether your kids are at home or back to school and in their activities. So teaching pro-social skills, good manners, sharing, simple problem solving as a way to arm our children with the skills to interact with each other in a more civilized way. Paying attention to personal space, making sure that every single one in the family has their own special place that they can go to when they want and need to be alone. And that includes mum and dad too. Looking at social isolation, as we talked about already, finding creative ways to connect outside of the people that you're blood relatives to, finding people of the same age and stage so that we can all see ourselves reflected in others and normalize the challenges that we're going through. Doing our best to balance every family member's individual needs, which might be unique and different from everybody else, with the needs of the family as a group. So keeping those two things in mind and trying to balance a little bit of each through the day. And helping our kids and us deal with some of the big emotions, helping them recognize them, give them a name, accept that they're right to be there, and work out how they're going to express them or let them go out into the world. So some of you might be wondering, what are the signs that maybe you could look for that might be indicators that your children are struggling? So they might be different at different ages. So we're going to, across some slides, look at different age groups. But for younger children, we need to remember that they are incredibly tuned in and sensitive to their parents' stress. And they may display their worries in ways that their caregivers misinterpret as misbehaviour. They're not being naughty, they're worried. So misbehaviour, oppositional defiant behaviour, temper tantrums might all be behaviours that underlying them we have a stressed or worried child. Parents might notice that toddlers and preschoolers are more fussy or more whiny than before. They might struggle to engage or focus in play compared to previously. They might be more aggressive in their play and in their behaviour towards others. Some children will sometimes show typically regressive behaviour, so going back to behaviours that they'd let go of, whether it's asking for a bottle, going back to thumb sucking, toileting accidents, not wanting to dress or feed themselves independently anymore, perhaps becoming clingier or more demanding, wanting to be carried, not sleeping as well as they had previously, or changes in sleep patterns, whether it's tough to get to sleep, waking up constantly or frequently through the night, having nightmares, sometimes not being able to nap during the day anymore, or taking a lot of time and needing a lot of attention to settle at nap or at bedtime. Not surprisingly, these stress reactions in children cause a lot of stress then for parents and can create self-doubt, feelings of inadequacy, that I must be doing something wrong, all of the stuff is coming back. And it can be really hard as a parent to always understand and empathise with a child when their behaviour is really challenging. So that creates then for the parents sometimes a sense of sort of sadness or low mood, of being, failing, out of control. Certainly can cause sleep deprivation for the parents. And as a result, caregivers and parents might feel like withdrawing from their children and the family home and shutting down. And that in return can create parental trauma and stress. So it really can be a vicious negative cycle. A stressed parent that's picked up by the children who are feeling stress but displaying it in all sorts of challenging or confusing behaviours, which is exhausting, tiring and confusing for the parent. And so, the cycle can be set up. So with older children, the signs of psychological distress can appear in similar or different ways. So changes in thinking, perhaps an increase in negative thoughts about themselves, being overly self-critical or blaming themselves for things that are really beyond their control, having difficulty concentrating or settling down to focus on schoolwork or other activities, and sometimes changes in school performance. So all changes related to the thinking patterns in their minds. Changes in feelings can be all sorts of different things, but sometimes reactions and feelings that seem bigger than is warranted by the situation. So sort of an overblown or what seems like an overreaction, or just an increase in feelings of unhappiness, worry, guilt, irritability, sadness, anger. Sometimes helplessness, hopelessness, or loneliness. So all changes in feelings different, and again this emphasis on feelings of sort of being down or low or sad. And regarding behaviour, again, can be different for different kids certainly, but some of the signs might be wanting to be alone a great deal of the time, always avoiding others, retreating to their own room, excluding themselves, being quick to tears or quick to anger, less interest in things that used to give them pleasure, whether it's sports, games, activities, art, music, just being disinterested and getting no pleasure from those things. Again, there's sort of the overreacting to what otherwise they might have considered relatively trivial or small incidents. And again, that sense of withdrawal, being quieter than usual, a bit lethargic, loss of energy, maybe changes in sleeping and relaxing, either way, not able to sleep or sleeping much more than usual, a lot of time kind of zoned out or daydreaming, again, falling back into less mature behaviours, things that they previously seem to have outgrown, and sometimes conflict or difficulty in their relationships with their peers. Some of the physical changes are the things that, I think you'll be aware of. Again, tummy aches or headaches that don't seem to be explained by any physical health issue or concern, general aches and pains, lack of energy, tiredness and fatigue, changes to sleeping and eating, either more of those things or significantly less of those things than before, too much energy, sort of that restless, difficulty settling to anything, and that can come out in behaviours like nail biting, hair twisting, thumb sucking, hair pulling, as examples. But please do remember, there are many explanations for these signs, and by themselves they don't necessarily mean that your child has a mental health concern, but they do warrant further curiosity and exploration. So I really encourage you to, again, if you're concerned about your child or you notice those things, use these tips on the slide as a way of, again, getting alongside your child to talk about what you've noticed, ask them to share with you what that feels like, just make yourself available to be present with them. Do your best to take care of yourself and model that healthy emotional care, physical care, so that they can see it, so they can take a lead from you, that self-care is important. Even though you may not feel it, do your best to stay calm and promote that sense of security and safety for your child so that they have that, and that may encourage them to be able to trust you and share a little more about what's going on. And if you do feel overwhelmed or are truly worried, don't be afraid to ask for help. So the next couple of slides have some sort of age-based language suggestions that you can use in that gentle, inquiring curiosity with your child. And the key principles are that it's important to keep language simple, straightforward, and honest. You may have had that experience of leading with a conversation with your child with a great big detailed explanation from start to finish, 10 minutes of facts and figures, and then get to the end and realize the child actually wasn't interested in that topic at all, or was actually trying to ask about something else. So again, be guided by your child. Start small, don't overdo it, and then be guided by your child's response, how much more they might want to know if they understood what you've said, and then answering their questions that'll guide you about where to go next. So for young children, keep it simple. For older children, a similar response approach might work, and they might be ready to receive more information and details, and they'll let you know by their curiosity. So again, wait for their questions and guide that, answer that question and then pause and see if they ask another. And if they do, answer that question and pause and keep going, and your child will take you to the edge of where they've got in their thinking and curiosity. It might be a good thing to check in the next day. So I've been thinking about that conversation. Now, have you? Do you have any more questions? And they might have processed things a little bit further and have some new questions with a little bit of time. So again, for older children, kickstart the conversation, invite them to be curious, encourage that openness and fear. about fears and about worries. By normalizing it and letting them know that you're thinking about these things too, then it might be easier for them to acknowledge their own experiences and share a bit of that with you. It can be helpful to check in with kids when we've been speaking with them, to make sure they understand the language that we're using and that's making sense, and to invite them to ask questions. So again, for teenagers, we change our language a little bit. That sounds very difficult. What could I do to help you feel better? So instead of assuming we know what they need, really inviting them to think about that and let us know. Sharing our own feelings in a way that's appropriate and can show that empathy. You know, I was really disappointed and sad today when I learned about how did that make you feel? And then again, engaging them in self-care and modeling appropriate behavior. Maybe we could take a walk together and help clear our heads. Do you want to help me cook dinner tonight? And you could pick what we're going to cook. It is always important with all children, especially teenagers, to be respectful around privacy and avoid taking over or dominating when we're going to talk about things and how much we're going to talk about things. Timing can be everything. And I'm sure many of you have had that experience, particularly with teens, that, you know, to sit down and confront them face to face is often not a good way to open up a conversation, but to be doing a shared activity together, whether it's driving in the car, doing the dishes beside each other, folding laundry, can be great opportunities to invite sharing. So as in the last script here, I can see that you're upset, or it looks like you're upset. I'm here for you when you're ready to talk about it. So letting them have that sense of control in a life that doesn't have much about when, who, and how much they want to talk. Also encourage you to really think about when there is a need for discipline, positive discipline. So this is really about focusing in on guiding and leading children where we want them to go for more positive mental health. So trying to find ways to say yes, or how about this, rather than, you know, focusing in on no and stop. So gently redirecting behavior can be effective in all ages. Really looking at creative play as a way of letting out different emotions and feelings. Looking at where we direct our attention. As a general rule, where we focus the behavior that we focus our attention on tends to continue and we get more of it. And the behavior that we ignore tends to fade away. So it is important to pick our battles and really think about what we want to reward, what we want to pay attention to, and using rewards and privileges for positive behavior to get more of the behavior we like, instead of punishing or taking away in response to the behavior that's not pro-social. So knowing when to respond and trying to discipline when we ourselves are in a calm mental state is probably going to be more effective than reacting when our own emotions are overwhelming us. So separate that out, know when to take ourselves a time out to manage and process our emotions so we can come back more calmly, and also sometimes knowing when we need to consider time out or time in for our children. And again, remembering, as always, the benefits of physical activity for children, not just for their bodies, but also for their mental health. So there is lots and lots of research and evidence really supporting the benefits of physical activity for all ages, including children, in protecting against depression and anxiety, decreasing stress, increasing self-confidence and competence, helping with appetite and helping with sleep, as well as lots of cognitive benefits like improving problem solving and our ability to manage our emotions. So year round, regardless of the weather, inside or outside, look for ways to engage your children in spurts of physical activity. The other thing that we can do that makes a huge difference to our children is to try and create a feeling of safety, even if we cannot guarantee it. So you may remember or be familiar with a movie that's not new at all called It's a Beautiful Life. It's a wonderful movie set with an adult guiding a young child through an incredibly difficult time. You know, everything that's going on outside is incredibly challenging and difficult, but creating this inner world of safety, security, and play. And it's a lovely example of illustrating the point that it is not our circumstances that truly create how we feel or experience the world. It's the state of mind that we bring to those circumstances. So it's a wonderful skill for us to nurture and enhance and develop for ourselves, and also create for our children that sense that you are safe and home is safe, and that it's going to be, you know, that you're going to keep an eye on them and you're going to do the best you can for them without making any promises or guarantees about what's going to happen out there in the rest of the world. So a really important part of all of this is parent and caregiver self-care. So parents and caregivers really have to take care of themselves as well. We know that when parents and caregivers are confident and free of stress, they are much more successful at guiding, educating, and protecting their children more effectively and more efficiently. You know, nobody was trained or prepared to parent during this pandemic. So we must recognise that that any increased anxiety or stress or worry that we're experiencing is normal in the abnormal circumstances that we're in. And I really believe that parents and caregivers are owed a special degree of compassion and grace from everyone around them, but most importantly from themselves. So if you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed, please know that you're not alone. The difference about how those who grow from challenging events versus those who are overwhelmed by them is how they choose to think about them. So most of the time we don't even really notice the thoughts that are going on in our head, whether they're negative or positive. They just flow through, but they have a huge impact on how we react, and how we feel, and then how we behave in response to those thoughts. So it's not the event that's happening out there in the world that's creating our reaction, but it's the thoughts we have about the event. So there's a lot of advantage in becoming more tuned in and more aware to the self-thoughts that are constantly playing around in our headspace, because they're having a huge influence in how we cope. And often the actions that we're driven to as a consequence of the thoughts we're having aren't very helpful to us, because they're not intended to be helpful. They're just intended to stop us feeling so stressed and overwhelmed. So it's really helpful to try and be more tuned in with what we're thinking and how we're feeling, so we can make more conscious choices about the practical strategies we're going to use to manage those feelings, rather than that fight, flight, and freeze response that happens sort of automatically. So we can't change, when we can't change things and we struggle to accept them, we actually just invite more suffering for ourselves. So accepting doesn't mean agreeing. Acceptance is really about trying to think differently. Things like, well, I'm in this situation, I don't like it, I wish it wasn't happening, but here it is what it is, so I can't change what happened. How am I going to move forward from here? So that self-compassion and acceptance to open up new ways of thinking, to focus in on what we can control. So I really like this slide that I think plays out so nicely those things outside of the circle that we can't control. So it makes sense to not spend too much energy on them, other than letting them go, and refocusing our energy on the things that we can control. So we have a lot of skills we can use about things we can't control, the sort of thinking that we talked about before, empathy, avoid getting in giving advice around things that people can't change, but really refocusing on those things that are within our ability to control them. And one of these things is practicing that healthy thinking. So many of you will be aware of the concept of mindfulness, that ability to pay attention to the present moment without judgment and noticing the thoughts that are in our head, but not accepting them as factual or true, just noticing them and bringing some sort of critical thinking and curiosity around, that's what I'm thinking. And how does that make me feel? And how am I reacting to that? And is that helpful, or could I do something different? Always focusing in on self-compassion, being kind, being forgiving, and treating ourselves with as much care and compassion as we would anybody else that we would care about going through a similar situation. And avoid catastrophizing, thinking this is going to be always, everywhere, and forever, and really remaining focused on this is one thing on one day, and it will pass, but right now, what can I do about it? Self-care strategies for parents, you've heard of these before, and nothing has changed. They remain the foundation of good self-care and our own good mental health. So managing and regulating our own routine, attending to our physical activity, sleep, and healthy eating, these are the foundations of positive mental health, and we cannot care for others if we have not cared for ourselves. So prioritizing your own well-being, in fact, benefits the whole family. So I'm mindful of the time, and I just have a couple more slides here. So many of you are working from home with children, and so this is a unique challenge, and I really encourage you to consider your expectations, their expectations, and the expectations of people at your workplace, and having some frank conversations with all parties to try and find some win-win solutions. So maybe nobody gets every one of their needs met, but everybody gets some of their needs met. And the ways to do that are the same themes that we've already talked about: having structure and routine in your day, having boundaries around spaces and time. What is work time? What is family time? What is personal time? What is rest time? What is exercise time? Trying to engage, depending on the age of your children, matching up their energy levels and when they're engaged in activities with times when you need to be less or more engaged with work. And above all else, making sure that work doesn't creep into all of the day, and that there are some parts of every day where you're able to be fully present for your children. So supporting yourself in the same way that we've talked about supporting your children across all of those spectrums of our mental health: physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. And if you need to, reaching out for some professional support if needed. So this is the last slide of the presentation with just some final reminders. And I think if nothing else, please read the last one. To treat yourself kindly with forgiveness and compassion. These are unprecedented times. There was no manual, and we are doing our very best, and not to underestimate the benefit of some of the quite simple concepts that we've talked about. So I'm going to have a look quickly at the questions, but I wanted to let you know or remind you, if you don't know, about this resource, Wellness Together Canada, funded by the federal government, free to all Canadians, that Homewood Health is a partner in, which is a way that anybody, adults and children, can access resources, and through either Kids Helpline or the Wellness Together Canada line, be able to connect with counselling support. If you're interested to find out more information, you can use any of these contact details here on the slide. And if you are customer contact for Homewood Health, please don't hesitate to reach out to your account representative or call our 1-800 number. So again, there are some slides with additional resources that it's too much to write down or remember, but will be available in the recording of this presentation. So that brings us to the end. I apologise for going a few minutes over time. There aren't any questions today, so I'm going to wrap it up there. And again, thank you for taking an hour out of your very busy day to be with us here at Homewood Health this evening to talk a little more about supporting our children's mental health. Thank you very much.